Hi, folks. I'm Denise Howell, and I'm here with my co-host Dave Levine on this episode of R&D with D&D. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Denise. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. We'd love to welcome you back to the Hearsay Culture Network. And this, our favorite show on the network, I've got to say, I have another favorite show called Uneven Distribution that you might want to check out, but that's for another day. We're here today with Cathy Gellis. Hi, Cathy. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So Cathy is an attorney, a one-time journalist, a longtime fan of civil liberties. And she is well known for defending the rights of internet users and advocating for policy that protects speech and innovation. She advises clients on platform liability, copyright, trademark, privacy, and cybersecurity. And she also writes about these subjects and more for outlets such as The Daily Beast, Law.com, and of course, DeckDirt.com, where she just published an article yesterday entitled In 303 Creative, by happily helping one bigot, SCOTUS perhaps inadvertently helped the larger fight against bigotry. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the show too. Cathy, it's so great to have you here with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I always like to talk about stuff like this.
I know we love to talk about stuff like this too, and we love to help explain some of the thornier aspects of the internet and the world around us to our listeners. So you and I just bumped into each other recently at a conference, a confab, if you want, of internet lawyers up at Stanford, sort of ground zero of all things internet law and policy up there. And you were speaking on a panel about child online safety, which I attended and found really, really fascinating. Anyone out there who has kids or is a young person is going to be interested in what's going on in that arena. And what's going on in that arena seems to be utter chaos these days. We've got quite a lot of laws getting thrown at us. Congress has passed many laws dealing with protecting children. In your view, Cathy, have any of them ever worked? And why have so many failed?
I think that the word chaos may be too kind. I think these are attempts to regulate things that people say, and no speech that has ever tried to regulate things that people say is a successful piece of legislation and also constitutional. So I think all of these are not understanding enough about the social dynamics of how people talk to each other and how they talk to each other as constrained by specific media. And without that understanding, they're looking at some externalities. And, I'm not going to sit here and say that the internet is lovely and sweetness and light and everything is perfect. But to understand what isn't perfect and why it isn't perfect requires very clear understanding of those problems and very careful solutions so that you actually fix things without inadvertently hurting more or even hurting the people you're actually trying to help. And most of this legislation, and I'm only caveating it because it's probably all of this legislation, tends to be very reactive, very scared, and perhaps for reasonable reasons. But instead of shooting for that understanding, it tends to be just say no to it. There ought to be a law. Let's say no. Let's say no. And they're trying to say no to an awful lot of things that people say when they have, for very good reason, the right to say things, and pretty expansively as our Constitution allows.
Do you feel, obviously Congress is motivated by the fact that there are some bad things that can happen to young people online, and they want to be answerable to their constituents and be able to say, hey, we've done something about that. Do you think that it's possible to do it without trampling too hard on our core free speech values?
I wouldn't say, I suppose there's something hypothetically that could be done. I mean, the Constitution does allow, and speaking as a lawyer, when it involves free expression, then for the law to be okay, it has to survive strict scrutiny, which basically means you have to be really, really careful. You have to have a very specific idea of what your problem is and a very specific solution that doesn't accidentally end up doing more, interact with more than what you really needed to do. You have to be very, very careful when there's constitutional rights involved. In theory, such laws very careful laws could exist and be constitutional and be reasonable and do more good than harm. We don't see the legislative exercise being nearly that careful. There are things that are very broadly trying to say no to all sorts of speech without necessarily even thinking about what else that might reach, including things that they would actually want to have continue to be online and to have, even if they're just thinking in the context of children, things that they would want children to be able to say or do. And then I think there's also the problem of that's assuming good faith. There's also a lot of people pushing legislation not in good faith because they're not actually worried about children and them not getting harmed by things. They want to be able to control the entire online dialogue. And they've found that if they package it up as think of the children, they might be able to get the lever to impose that power on it. I don't think there's a lot of space between attempts to take the internet away from kids and the attempts to take books away from kids. I really think it's in very specific circumstances, it's motivated by exactly the same legislative intent, but the effect is the same, even if the intent is different.
This brings us to that very issue, to one of the core criticisms as it relates to this kind of behavior and what Congress claims to be dealing with, which is the incessant marketing of content and everything else to children. The internet, of course, is a marketing medium. We know that, and we see it in the podcast world. But what's your view on targeting children on the internet, particularly with advertisements? There's been increasing studies on social media. Of course, the Surgeon General, right, has recently commented on these issues in terms of social media. But more broadly, Cathy, what's your take on the marketing of consumer goods and other items to children via the internet?
Well, I think there's a couple points to make. One of which, there is a difference between thinking some of the things that are happening online today are really bad ideas. I might agree that a lot of the things that we're talking about as being bad ideas are truly bad ideas, and seriously, people in charge, knock it off. But that's not the same thing as saying there should be a law to stop that bad idea. These are very different things. I am inclined as a lawyer to protect really bad ideas, because if I don't protect the really bad ideas, I think the good ideas are in trouble. At the same time, I'm perfectly happy to join the chorus of saying this is a bad idea, knock it off, and let's use whatever non-legal power we have to be able to pressure the stupid ideas to, wisen up and stop being so stupid. So I think some of what you're getting at in the advertising to children space is this is a bad idea, knock it off. But the second point I would make is, as you phrased it generally, like advertise to children, oh my gosh, what a terrible idea. Well, I'm thinking about Saturday morning cartoons where you had kids watching and you put on the little thing about the Crest gel animations where they had the little spaceship that ran around and cleaned the teeth. And that was a cartoon to sell toothpaste to kids. So the idea that you can't advertise to kids, that if we were to say that is the rule, I think we would take out a whole lot of reasonable advertising that we're actually quite comfortable with as a society and possibly need as a society. So again, that's about, if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand the problem and then carefully tailor your proposed solution so that you don't accidentally take away something that you are actually totally fine with and perhaps needed.
Well, so would you say there is a problem here, or is it much ado about nothing? Because on one level, right, you've got something like video games, right, where many have made the allegation with not a lot of evidence that video games cause people to be violent. On the other hand, of course, going back decades, smoking advertisement was banned precisely because of the impact on children. Are those fair comparisons, or is the internet something different? Or is there really not a problem, not only to be solved by law, but arguably not a problem to be solved by the markets or anyone else?
Well, I think what you intimated at with the video games is that was a moral panic of, the same with rock music. Like our children, their brains are rotting because of these new cultural things that the grownups don't understand. And as you pointed out, the science of whether video games actually did rot anybody's brain is really not very credible to suggest that there's a direct link. So a lot of this is really a hypothetical sense of harm as opposed to an actual demonstrable harm with that sort of causal effect. But that's, oh, I had a brilliant thought that was about to follow from it. Oh, I didn't know the thought. Some of the problem is that when we're talking about targeting advertising to kids, the objection is less what is being, what message they're consuming. I think a lot of the objection is advertising on the internet, at least, well, in some ways it works exactly the way old school advertising worked. And old school advertising really liked to have a sense of who was watching so that you would sell to advertisers who wanted to target that market. So you would have the Crest cartoons on in the morning when kids were watching their other cartoons, and not necessarily during the Super Bowl or something like that, when you have different people watching different advertisements. And so you've always had the capacity to tailor your advertisement for your demographics as you understood them to be consuming your content. The issue with the internet is the way we track this is a lot more robust in terms of giving the platforms and the advertisers the knowledge of who's watching. And this is leading to tracking. And there are, I think, much more legitimate concerns about tracking younger people. I mean, quite frankly, there's bigger concerns about tracking anybody, but certainly to track younger people. And again, I think we're not being careful with the legislation, like to say that that's the problem we want to target, I think leads to slightly different regulatory solutions than to say that you can't give advertisement to kids at all. I mean, one of the ironies with some of these proposals is the way they're making this rule of like, if you target kids, you can't do X, means that you're actually having to target everybody much more and understand much more about your internet user and require more specific and identifying data from their users. So instead of actually addressing a privacy problem, you've just enhanced the privacy problem. But I think that's that fear of the tracking, I think, is generally motivating more of the regulation in terms of advertisement. In terms of other forms of content, like the general content that you go to a platform for, then I think it might be a little bit more content-based in what the concerns are, but I don't necessarily think that the objections are well thought out.
Yeah, and I'd just throw in too that another concern when it comes to the internet or gaming or any of our sort of new media platforms where ads are integrated in a way that doesn't resemble Saturday morning cartoons, where the regular programming ends and then there's a very clear demarcation between your programming and your advertising.
Parents are awake now to we're changing the content that we're showing them.
Right. So, in today's day and age, it's very hard for adults oftentimes to figure out whether what they're experiencing is some sort of sponsored content or not. And so I think that rightly so, there's attention being paid to, well, we don't want to just delude kids into thinking that this is some sort of I'm not sure the word that I'm searching for, legitimate, unpaid for experience, or whether they're being advertised to. And I think a lot of kids are sophisticated enough to get the difference between those two things. Maybe very, very young kids know, but and maybe we should think about advertising to them differently. But as things stand today, again, back to chaos and the wild, wild west of where we are today, trying to figure out how you're going to thread that needle of, okay, so we're going to have some part of our experience is going to be sponsored and some is not. And, how do we make that clear to every single one of our audience is a challenge. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It can be, but I'm not thinking that this is actually what people are most freaked out about. They seem to be, I mean, to the extent that there's the privacy problems, they're worried about the tracking of acquiring the behavioral tracking of a person as they go through their online experience, and then you building a database of what the system now knows about this person, and then selling what it knows about this person to somebody else. And certainly to say that that's insidious with some really significant downsides is not unreasonable. What you do with that, I think you have to be careful about, because I think if you paint with too broad a brush, you accidentally do have some First Amendment harms that you really shouldn't have. But that alarm is fine. But there's also the people who they're really more bothered by the online experience where, they'll frame it in terms of bullying. And I also can't say that there's none of that online. Of course, there's been that all the time. But there tends to be this assumption that the online experience for all children is so negative, and just overwhelmingly negative at the expense. It almost doesn't occur to people that there's actually plenty positive, and also that it's an important outlet to deal with other dysfunction that kids end up interacting with in their real life. It's all whole and no donut in motivating some of this legislation. And I think that's a problem. There's a lot of donut here, and it's really important. It's something we really enjoy and would miss when we don't have it anymore.
Right.
Actually, I mean, free speech is more important than a donut. I think this is not I'm killing my own metaphor. I don't think I give the internet enough praise. But the point being, looking at all of a negative thing as opposed to the upside is not a very good way to run a railroad.
Right. And I think you're starting to answer my next question. I'm wondering if you ever read a book by Gary Small that was called iBrain. It was published some 10 years or more ago. It argued that children lack the psychological development to handle powerful devices like iPhones and apps and social media, and I guess the internet as well.
And physiological development. Also.
Yes.
Development of the brain.
Yes.
In children. Yeah.
I should dig up the picture of me being 5 years old and playing with a pet computer, or a picture of me using my Atari 800 when I was 6 or 7, or the online system that turns out to have been a precursor to Prodigy. And Prodigy, like this was before Prodigy, that I used in, I think, 1983, and I was still in elementary school. So like, I don't buy that at all. Unless they want to say that, my opinions now were totally ruined by the fact that I was so exposed to technology so young. But I think I grew up okay. I'm a reasonably responsible member of society. I haven't committed any serious crimes, and now, I'm a respectable lawyer. So I think it's actually okay to expose young children to technology. They can handle it. And I think whatever we might want to do to carefully raise our children takes a lot more thought than any of these legislative rules are incorporating into them.
Yeah, I think we should take a moment to reminisce about, I appreciated your youthful memories of your first exposures to technology. Dave, do you have one?
I do. I mean, so it's very funny. And quickly, you've driven across the United States, our family, and we stopped in a Wild West style town in North Dakota that had a land surveying exhibit. And among the land surveying exhibit was, wait for it, a TRS-80. And the Radio Shack computer, or Texas Instruments from the mid 80s, that was the first computer I worked on. And to my sons, it looked like a relic, and now it's in a museum. But my fond memory of trying to get the TRS-80 to say Dave, 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 Dave on down the screen in basic code is one of the happiest times of my life.
Yeah, mine's real similar. I went on a field trip to the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley with my class. I was probably in 3rd grade. And they had, huge room-sized computers there. It might have been a TRS-80, I'm not sure. But they also had dot matrix printers. And what the scientists there were up to with these powerful machines, at least for our purposes as 3rd graders, was creating ASCII art and printing it out on dot matrix printers. And we were so impressed.
So I have this other memory that I was in a music class learning how to read sheet music and learning about sharps and flats, and having it explained that you would indicate the sharp or flat in a measure, and then at the end of the measure it would forget it. So if you wanted it to continue, you needed to reapply it. And I just kind of piped up, because at that point we had our Atari 800. I'm kind of like, oh, like a computer if you turn it off. And for me, this was like a logical thought. And everyone just looked at me as like this weird little geeky kid that knew about computers sort of way back before everybody had them in their home. But yeah, I think young brains can understand technology, and I think we don't give them enough credit for understanding it. And we end up making rules that just take away whatever empowerment they actually need to be able to use the technology safely without being hurt by it.
So let me follow up there, Cathy, and it kind of gets us to what the law de rigueur on technology, which is Section 230. But before we get there, I do increasingly play the role of the technology skeptic or Luddite on R&D, and so I'm going to play it here for a moment and now kind of counter my own point and yours and Denise's. We're talking about the TRS-80 and other computers that were more or less standalone, at least in the 80s, weren't connected to the internet unless they were very advanced. And now we've got these devices, of course, and you know this argument, that are held in your hand, that can connect you to the entire world, where, as Victor Mayer Schauberger has famously written, nothing can be deleted. How much can we learn in terms of what, in your view, Cathy, in terms of what children can handle with technology from technologies that lack the capacity to do the kinds of things that current technology do, from social media to computing, combined with the fact that it's shared with the world instantaneously? Is it fair to use these comparisons, or do you think there's a technological difference that's worth noting?
I think it's fair from a technological perspective. And one of the examples I cited was I was somewhere in second or third grade, and my family was one of the pilot programs for the early Prodigy service before it became Prodigy. And I remember that like it was a bulletin board service. So this was the 80s, and we had a terminal that had connectivity, and that the value you were getting back was how you were participating with the community. And I remember things like you could order groceries, you could draw like ASCII art and have it uploaded to a community bulletin board. I remember the moderation rules that were essentially built into this. And the point being, like, yeah, maybe more people are using it now, but it's a lot less new than people thought about. And that, this interconnected telecommunications technology is something we've been dealing with for a long, long time. In France, they were dealing with Minitel. Like, you could interconnect people with technology, and yeah, it does raise some issues, but the issues are not necessarily new. And treating them like they are new and unprecedented, I think, is a disservice as we try to figure out how to cope with them. I think what gets a little bit more interesting is that the sense of communities tended to be different, and who you could interact with within the world there was a certain scarcity built into relationships, that you had distance and time that tended to slow down your ability to exchange ideas on a regular basis. And how you learn to interact with a distant community, and over time and over space and with more people, there are some interesting things with that, like the way you communicate with everybody. And I think maybe sociologically, we have not quite adapted as well as we might need to figure out what does it mean when you, in theory, can talk to anybody in the world pretty much instantaneously. That's a little unprecedented. I sometimes talk about how, never before in human history have we been able to have all 7 billion of us talk to each other. And it's going to take some time to kind of figure out how to do that without, having the worst of us all of a sudden taint the entire experience for everybody. But I think we can do that. And I think the solutions are much more human and a lot less regulatory or even necessarily technological. Although to some extent, I think the technology could respond better than it does. And I think it's just not really been a priority to design better technology. But I do worry that in the absence of, more designers paying more attention to more things, we're trying to use a big regulatory club to force them to. And I just don't think that's actually going to bring about any sort of improvement whatsoever.
Let's turn a little bit, because we have about halfway through our interview on R&D with D&D on the Hearsay Culture Network. You've raised it, and let's just get this one on the table. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, Congress's most hated internet law at the moment, at least, that shields social media companies from defamation claims. Sex trafficking ads were recently, a few years ago now, carved out of Section 230 for protection. So in other words, for the non-lawyers listening, of which there may be many, the social media companies and others that could have used Section 230 to protect them from liability regarding sex trafficking ads no longer have that protection. What do you make of that particular carve out? Do you think that was a good solution, which really ties to broader questions that I think Denise is going to follow up on with other regulatory efforts that try to address these issues?
It was a disaster. I mean, first of all, Section 230, not everyone hates it. Very loud people hate it, and a few too many people hate it, but I like it. I think it's good. And I think anybody who actually enjoys anything on the internet likes it, whether they know it or not, because this is what has enabled anything good to sprout on the internet. So the Section 230 really should have a much bigger fan club than has necessarily been organized. It also speaks to more than just defamation claims. It's basically a principle that, to put it very superficially, you're not your brother's keeper. You're responsible for your own stuff, but you're not responsible for someone else's stuff. And that sort of rule about what's kind of called secondary liability is not something new to law. It's something actually kind of traditional and built in, and has already been part of our First Amendment law for an awfully long time. And there are sometimes there are reasons why you want to make somebody responsible for what somebody else has said or done, but there's also significant consequences to doing that. Like, it's not particularly fair necessarily to make somebody responsible for something that somebody else did wrong. And it also tends to chill whoever you've just made liable from doing whatever it was that associated them with the person who said or did something wrong, because now they don't want to be in the position of helping anybody say or do something right, because this is legally dangerous for them to try. And when it comes to the operation of the internet, which inherently needs helpers, you need somebody to help your message get from your brain in where you're sitting, through your computer, through the network, to somebody else's computer, to their brains. Like, you need a whole bunch of helpers to help intermediate that. And Section 230 is just trying to make sure that the principles of law that said you're not responsible for what somebody else did can apply clearly and easily and non-expensively, so that platforms can be like, I can be in the business of helping enable content going from one person's brain to another person's brain. And when you start to poke holes in that protection, you start to make the platforms look over their shoulder and be like, I don't think I can be in the helping business anymore. And then they're not in the helping business anymore. And one of the things that happened in the wake of FOSTA that you're referring to is they got out of the helping business for an awful lot of content that really needed the help to be said, because it essentially censored that content. And when that content got censored, people died. That was a law with a body count attached to it, because even though ostensibly it was trying to, crack down on like people who sex-related businesses, and some of them may not be particularly legal, but they're nevertheless getting plied by people, and the people doing the sex work were being saved by the fact that when they could use the internet to facilitate their business, they had a lot more agency over their interactions, and therefore could be a lot safer because they could exercise some discretion over them. When they lost the ability to apply their craft or trade or whatever over the internet, they didn't stop doing the work. They went back in the streets, where they ended up with pimps and exploitation and got hurt or killed. So we didn't solve any problems. And it also ended up driving some platforms to just say no to a whole lot of other content that wasn't even intended to be reached by it, because it was just such a broad brush. So like Craigslist took down personal ads for dating because, oh my gosh, that's adults getting together and eventually having adult sort of relationships, but some of that might be illegal. So we better say no to it, because we can't deal with the risk of not saying no to the right thing. That was a huge problem. It was censorial. It took away people's ability to be massage therapists, because are they really doing massage, or is it massage with quotes? And the platforms are like, just can't take the risk of helping any of it, no matter how legitimate and lawful it is. So it ended up leading to censorship of perfectly lawful speech. So this is a mess. And this is why we need Section 230 if you want to have lawful speech happen, because you have to make it safe for the helpers to help it happen.
Right. And didn't it wind up, since we can only apply U.S. laws to websites that operate in the U.S. or have a significant tie to the U.S., didn't it wind up just driving a lot of that offshore?
Every time, yes. And well, yes, because actually one of the things it also did is Section 230 did something else. It made itself safe for the helpers to help, but it also made it safe for the helpers to moderate and actually try to police their own sites, because it made it that there would not be a legal risk attached to kicking off any speech that happened. And this was important because Congress passed Section 230 to get rid of the worst stuff on the internet. Half of it was to help make sure we could get the best stuff on the internet, but the other half of its purpose was to help make sure that we could get rid of the worst. And it ended up being very clever because it let the platforms be partners with it to help them be partners with what Congress wanted, which was to police the internet. Congress couldn't do that itself because that's unconstitutional interference with speech. But if the platforms do it on their own editorial discretion because they actually want to not help garbage get spread, that's great. So it also gave a legal regime that gave them the protection where they could do that policing. And FOSTA ended up messing with that legislative bargain, which made it riskier for platforms to do that policing than if they just turned a blind eye to everything. So it didn't achieve any legitimate goal that Congress actually had. But in terms of some of the stuff that maybe you would have wanted the platforms to be able to continue to host that material so they could police it. If they can't be in the business of hosting it, and it's going to go somewhere else, then good luck being able to police it, because it will be offshore and you won't have any reach over it.
Right. Okay, well, let's get into a current event here and the article I mentioned at the top of the show that you just published on TechDirt. And if you're not familiar with TechDirt, I highly encourage you to check out this longtime home of great journalism on the web with Cathy and Mike Masnick and others there who really do deep dives on all the issues that impact social media, the web in general. I mean, really, if you're looking for one-stop shopping of the meaty news that governs the internet, TechDirt is it. So kudos to you for writing there, Cathy, and also for this piece that you just published yesterday in the 303 creative case, which is a 6-3 Supreme Court decision that was just decided last week. Can you tell us about that case?
Yeah, this is a case where the optics of it are clouding the legal meaning of it, and in ways that I think might be unfortunate, because it ultimately was a good case that protected civil liberties, but not necessarily in an abstract way where, only crappy people get to benefit from it, but in a way that's going to be meaningful for exactly the same people that the crappy people want to hurt. Because we've seen this. This is live. We see bigoted people, particularly and let's speak specifically about those in government that want to change law to make the world fit their bigoted image about how people should be. And we see this coming out of Texas. We see this coming out of Florida. We're starting to see it come out of other states where the leadership there wants to get rid of anyone they don't like and make the world only what they do. And one of the ways that they're trying to do this is to make sure that people can't speak out against this. And one of the ways they do that is to try to change online speech so that only the speech they like really is the speech that ultimately can get online. So Texas and Florida in particular have laws that require platforms to help the speech that they like get online, and potentially at the detriment of the speech that pushes back against it. And this decision ended up speaking to the ability of a web designer to refuse to help speech she didn't like. Now, in this particular case, she didn't like speech about gay marriage. I'm not trying to cheer for her particular position. And the problem with this case is that it looks like, oh crap, the conservative majority has just stuck it to gays again, and this is all terrible. But you have to look past that optic, because yes, they helped her say no to speech she didn't like, but that meant that it really constrained the government in any capacity from shaping what speech people can help get said. And that means that the platforms should be able to say no to Governors Abbott and DeSantis of Texas and Florida when they want to order platforms to only do their bidding and advance the messages they prefer. So in the long run, if you're going to push back against bigotry, you really need to have free expression yourself, and you need that free expression to be expansive enough that it can reach the helpers you need to do that speaking. And had this case gone the other way, you wouldn't have that freedom. That terrible people in government would be able to say no to the things you wanted to say against them, or require people to not help you say these things, and that wouldn't advance any of the interests that people are upset about this decision wanting to advance.
Right. So just to make it crystal clear for our listeners who are not lawyers, maybe our listeners who are web designers,
Sure.
When someone comes to you and wants you to design a web page for them, and you don't agree with either the content of the web page, or you just don't like the cut of that person's suit, for whatever reason, you don't want to do business with that person who's come to you to design their website, where do things stand now for you?
So one key thing that's getting confused in the reporting of this decision is, and I mean, even in Justice Sotomayor's dissent, unfortunately, was the sense that this decision stood for the idea that any business could discriminate against any customer, including if they showed up with a protected class, which tends to cover race and religion and sexuality. And the rules vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that sort of thing. And it doesn't. It doesn't greenlight discrimination of a business that basically provides a standardized product, sells stuff, is a place of public accommodation like that. All that anti-discrimination law stands untouched. This majority may someday want to do away with it, and maybe they will, but they didn't do it with this case. What they did was look very closely at the thing that she was selling was her own expressive services, her own expression, and her own expressive discretion. And that's the thing that the government can't say, no, you don't get to have that discretion anymore because we don't like the message that is driving you. Like in this case, the government shouldn't be able to say you must, well, it shouldn't be able to say no to the things you want to say. But the way this case was teed up is it shouldn't be able to force you to say things you don't want to say. And the court looked at the facts of this, which was Colorado wanted to be able to force her to say things that were celebratory of a gay marriage when she doesn't like gay marriage. And I think our feelings about her opinion have been coloring the fact that it doesn't really matter what she liked or didn't like. It's that she was a person who didn't want to say something. And this case reiterated that everyone has the right to say no and not be forced to say something that they don't want to say. It was really about the message she was asked to convey and not about being in business generally. And I think the reporting and the dissent that reframed it as a general business thing is inaccurate. And it's unfortunate because I think it's a really important decision that for the people who are most upset about this case, it is a decision that really helps them tremendously overall.
Thank you. It's confusing, and I'm sure we'll continue to unpack it, and the ramifications of it will continue to play out. Dave, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, sure. And just on that point, Cathy, right? It's, the expansion of Supreme Court doctrine into areas that are either not applicable or are beyond the scope of what the court maybe intended is part of the challenge here too, particularly when you seize on, misunderstood phrases like free speech, which is always or almost regularly misused, since time immemorial. These speech issues, though, also arise in the context of, and returning these broader issues, social media companies, right, who have set up at the standard for social media the idea that we are going to allow for sharing. And so we have a short amount of time before we get to our speed round, which is coming up in just a few minutes. So let me ask you this one very quickly. Social media companies, and we've alluded to it, get a lot of criticism for not doing more to filter speech. And then other times, again, without evidence, right? There have been allegations of social media squelch conservative voices, which again has not been borne out. Broad question, particularly in light of the fact that we're recording on July 7th, and just a few days ago, right, Meta launched Threads as a direct competitor to Twitter with allegations which have yet to be proffered beyond a letter of trade secret misappropriation and the like. If you were to prescribe what, if anything, social media companies should do that they're not doing, okay, would there be anything more that you think that they should be doing to address broadly the kinds of concerns that we've been discussing now for about 40 minutes on this show?
Well, to think about a blog post I've been chewing on, actually it's a hard question to answer because I feel like I'm getting baited into saying something that like can easily be thrown back on the bumper sticker against me. I don't think
well, we're not setting you up for anything.
I plan to run for office someday. I don't know. I'm just trying to lay out the groundwork. But I think the problem is, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that the company should do differently or better. But I also think that we are defeated by expectations of them that are not reasonable. That a lot of the criticism of, for example, you said some people complain that they left too much up and some people claim that you took too much down. And you're actually in many instances talking about exactly the same stuff. Right. So if people can't agree, how can the company necessarily do better? Because to do better to please some of the people, they will antagonize the other people. So our concept of doing better is one that I think we have to be much more careful of. At the same time, I think they golden goose their own user communities. I think they don't give them the design tools that would really help them control their user experience as well as they should. I'm just hesitant in necessarily phrasing that because some of the regulatory approaches have been like, let me constrain how you design your website. But one of the other things this 303 Creative case hit on was that coding itself is expressive and therefore the First Amendment governs. So I really worry about the regulation that's like, let me tell you how you lay out your newspaper. Let me tell you how you design your website. I think these things are very similar and all protected by the First Amendment. And so, again, it's the distinction between what do I think should be better about the world or what do I want to complain about versus what do I want a law to do. So I'm going to criticize design, but I don't think there should be a law as the mechanism that we're going to get better design. But if we're sitting here aspirationally talking about something that should be better, yeah, I would throw that on the list.
So before we get to the speed round, and Denise is going to start us off there, I want to close this part of our discussion with this question. You've mentioned several times the need for coders and technologists to bake ethics and more design thinking into what they're doing. And that's something that's been talked about for quite a while. Are you optimistic that particularly, and I know this is a hard question to answer and what I'm going to ask for about 1 minute, you answer, are you optimistic at all that AI and all of the concerns around AI, both positive and negative, might cause coders to think more critically about the code that they're putting out there and therefore achieve that end? Or do you see a lot more of the same?
I find AI to be one of the most boring topics because it isn't anything that people seems to think it is. Software is interesting. Dynamic software is interesting. Really smart software that can do a lot of stuff is interesting, but we're not thinking about it in terms of, sophisticated software that we're applying to problems where you would really want to have sophisticated software. We keep treating it like magic that we're going to impose at the, instead of the human beings behind it, and treating it as if it's something that's not inherently attached to the human beings that develop it and or use it. And it's just, I find so many of the conversations just so boring because they're built on these expectations that it is something that it is not. So I think to answer your question, no, I don't think AI is it's neither like the hindrance nor the help because it's just not that interesting. It's not magic. It's just a piece of really sophisticated software that has some interesting uses. So I think but if you ask generally, like, do I think we're on a trajectory where we could improve things? I don't know if we're well on the trajectory, but I certainly think improvement is possible.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Cathy. We're recording today about 24 hours after Meta launched Threads. So here's our first speed round question. Threads, Twitter, Mastodon, or Blue Sky?
Mastodon. Should I explain my answer? I'm happy to. No, all right.
No, actually, that's part of the speed. It's a mystery. It's a mystery.
Okay, lack of context. That'll always help. Okay, exactly. What's the next?
Well, maybe a little context from the preceding 40 minutes. But is it ever okay to talk about yelling fire in a crowded theater?
It's not illegal.
I love it. Best video or online game?
I'm sorry, I missed the.
The best video game or online game, in your opinion?
I like Heroes of Might and Magic 3. I play it. Can't say if it's best, but I like it.
There we go.
You alluded to the answer here, but maybe we're framing it a little bit differently. Artificial superintelligence, salvation or sayonara?
Pointless.
Best view in San Francisco?
I like the waterfront.
What's the most interesting thing you've read in the last week?
I'm sure I've read some witty skeets.
Well, that one might require context.
Yeah,
Skeets?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm too hip. Sorry. As a joke, somebody decided there was a conversation one day when Blue Sky was actually smaller than it currently is, where people were like, "What should we call it?" And somebody was joking skeet, but the community was just the right size where it could fully adopt that as the terminology and then accidentally get stuck with it. I don't know if it will stick. People have proposed other ones, and at this point, saying post is probably the same thing because you can cover your tweets, your Mastodon toots or whatever. So I don't know. This may be a moment in time, but at the moment, that's what a Blue Sky tweet is often referred to as a skeet.
So you're moonlighting on Blue Sky when you're not on Mastodon.
Well, one of the context I was not allowed to go into is one of the things for Mastodon is it's public. Yeah, and I think that's valuable, which Blue Sky is not. And I like the UI a little bit better.
I guess we're modifying our rules to the speed round, which makes sense.
I'm sorry, I'm just
no, you didn't modify it. No,
I did.
Denise
I'm allowed to change the rules.
Exactly. Yeah, Denise and I can change rules. I guess the rule is if the hosts themselves don't know what's been said to them, then I guess we need more context. Because I didn't know that either.
Okay.
So we've learned a lot here today. Cathy Gellis, San Francisco-based internet lawyer, expert on speech platforms and the like. Thank you so much for joining us on the Hearsay Culture Network's R&D with D&D.
Thanks for having me.